today I will be explaining the whole 100 years of war. But before that, let me know when and where are you watching this video from. Now, let's begin. In the early 1300s, Europe was not a peaceful place. The air itself seemed heavy with fear, ambition, and hunger. Kings ruled by bloodlines, not ballots. Land meant power. Blood meant legitimacy. And every crown in Europe rested on stories people told themselves about who deserved to rule and who did not. In this world, England and France stood like two rival giants, staring at each other across the narrow strip of water called the English Channel, each convinced that destiny was on their side. France was rich, fertile, and crowded. Its fields rolled endlessly, feeding millions. Its cities were old and proud. Paris was already one of the largest cities in Europe. France believed itself the heart of Christendom. England, by contrast, was smaller and rougher, with fewer people and harsher land. But England had something just as powerful as French wealth: a dangerous confidence born from conquest and memory. Less than 3 centuries earlier, in 1066, a French duke named William of Normandy had crossed the Channel and conquered England. From that moment on, English kings spoke French, married French nobles, and owned vast lands inside France itself. This strange situation meant the King of England was also a powerful lord inside the Kingdom of France. 2 crowns tangled together, 2 identities forced into one body. At first, this tension simmered quietly, but by the early 14th century, the fragile balance began to crack. The trouble truly began with a death. In 1328, King Charles IV of France died suddenly. He left no sons, no clear male heir, and in medieval Europe, this was not just a family problem. It was a political earthquake. The French nobles gathered, anxious and suspicious, knowing that whoever wore the crown next would decide the future of the realm. Across the sea in England, a young king watched closely. His name was Edward III. He was only in his mid-teens, but he carried a powerful claim. His mother, Isabella, was the sister of the dead French king. By blood, Edward was the closest living male descendant of the French royal line. In Edward's mind, the logic was simple. His blood connected him directly to the French crown. He believed France should be his, but France did not see it that way. French nobles argued that a woman could not pass on the right to rule. They pointed to old traditions and half-forgotten laws. They chose another man instead, Philip of Valois, a French noble with strong local support. He became King Philip VI of France. To the French, this decision felt safe. Philip was French, raised among them, loyal to their customs. To Edward, it felt like theft. At first, Edward did not fight. He was young, surrounded by enemies at home, and unsure of his strength. He even knelt before Philip and swore swore loyalty for his lands in France. But the humiliation burned quietly inside him. Every court whisper, every French insult, every border dispute added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, France and England clashed in other ways. They fought over trade routes, especially in the rich region of Flanders, where English wool fed powerful cloth industries. They competed at sea, raiding each other's ports and ships. Pirates blurred the line between war and crime. Villages burned. Fishermen vanished. Fear spread along the coasts. By the late 1330s, patience was gone. In 1337, Philip VI declared that Edward had broken his obligations and seized Edward's lands in France. It was a bold move, a final insult. Edward responded not with silence, but with a declaration that would change history. He announced that he was the true king of France, not a challenger, not a rebel, the rightful ruler. With those words, a war began that no one alive would see the end of. At first, few understood what was coming. Medieval wars were usually short. A season of fighting, a treaty, a marriage, then peace. But this war was different. It was rooted in identity, pride, and inheritance. It was not just about land. It was about who belonged on the throne of France itself. Armies began to gather. Knights polished armor. Blacksmiths worked day and night. Longbows were strung. Horses were trained for battle. Across England, men were called to fight a war most of them did not understand, in a land many would never return from. France, confident in its numbers and tradition, believed it would crush England quickly. After all, France had more soldiers, more wealth, and the finest knights in Europe. England, smaller and poorer, seemed like an annoyance, not a real threat. But beneath the surface, something was changing. England's armies were evolving. They relied less on armored knights and more on disciplined infantry. The English longbow, simple but deadly, could pierce armor from a distance. English commanders learned to choose their ground carefully, forcing enemies to attack uphill, through mud, rain, and chaos. The first English expeditions into France felt like storms. They moved fast, burned towns, destroyed crops, and vanished before French armies could respond. This strategy, brutal and deliberate, aimed to break France's economy and morale. Civilians suffered first. Farmers watched their fields burn. Churches were looted. Roads filled with refugees. The war that kings declared fell hardest on people who had no voice in it. Still, most believed it would end soon. They were wrong. As Edward prepared to personally lead his forces into France, Europe held its breath. France gathered its knights, confident in centuries of chivalry and tradition. England sharpened its arrows, trusting innovation and discipline. Two visions of warfare were about to collide, and when they did, nothing in medieval Europe would ever be the same. The first great clash was coming. on a quiet stretch of French land called Crécy, where pride, blood, and history would meet under a darkening sky. The summer of 1346 arrived heavy and wet, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Edward III crossed the English Channel not like a cautious king testing the waters, but like a gambler pushing all his coins onto the table. His army landed in Normandy, a region rich with farms, towns, and old memories of English rule. The soldiers moved fast, almost recklessly, cutting through the countryside. Villages burned behind them. Smoke rose in long black columns, visible for miles. This was not just war, it was a message. England had returned. French nobles were furious. To them, Edward was not only invading their land, he was insulting their honor. King Philip VI called his banners. Knights from every corner of France answered. They arrived in shining armor, proud banners fluttering above them, confident that their sheer numbers and noble blood would crush the English intruders. The French army grew massive, larger than anything Edward could field. To many, the outcome seemed obvious. Edward knew he could not outrun the French forever. His men were tired. Supplies were low. So he chose to stand and fight. He selected a small village near the river Somme, close to a place called Crécy. The ground was uneven, slightly uphill, softened by recent rain. It was not beautiful, but it was perfect for defense. Edward positioned his army with careful thought. His knights dismounted and stood shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers. This alone shocked observers. In France, knights fought on horseback, charging like thunder. To fight on foot felt beneath them. But Edward understood something Philip did not. War was changing. At the front, Edward placed his longbowmen. These were not nobles. They were farmers, hunters, and village men trained from childhood to use the bow. Their weapons were simple pieces of wood, but in skilled hands, they were terrifying. Behind them stood men-at-arms, ready to hold the line if the enemy reached them. Edward himself stayed near the center, calm, watching, waiting. On August 26, 1346, the French army arrived. They came in chaos. Philip's forces had marched hard all day, eager to catch the English before they could escape. Many soldiers were exhausted. The army stretched unevenly across the landscape. Command was loose. Pride pushed them forward faster than reason. When Philip saw the English lines waiting on the hill, he hesitated. But his nobles did not. They demanded battle. They wanted blood. They wanted glory. The French attack began without order. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, hired mercenaries sent forward to weaken the English line. They marched into position as the sky darkened and rain began to fall. The moisture soaked their bowstrings, making their weapons slower and weaker. The English longbowmen, prepared for this, simply removed their bowstrings and kept them dry under their hats and cloaks. When the rain passed, they restrung them in moments. The Genoese fired first. Their bolts fell short. Then Edward gave the signal. The English longbowmen stepped forward and unleashed a storm of arrows. The sound was like ripping cloth, like wind tearing through trees. Arrows darkened the sky, falling into the Genoese ranks with brutal precision. Men screamed. Shields splintered. Panic spread instantly. The Genoese tried to retreat, but behind them came the French knights, already charging. What followed was chaos layered upon chaos. French knights rode down their own allies, trampling the retreating crossbowmen without mercy. Horses slipped in the mud. Armor weighed men down as arrows punched through weak points, visors, joints, necks. The proud cavalry charge, the symbol of French power, collapsed into confusion. Wave after wave of knights attacked the English line. Each time they were met with arrows, then steel. Bodies piled up. Horses screamed. The ground became slick with blood and rain. Still, the French kept coming, driven by pride and fury, unable to accept defeat. Edward's young son, the Black Prince, commanded part of the line. At one moment, he was pressed hard by the enemy. Messengers rushed to Edward, asking if he would send help. Edward listened, then shook his head. He wanted his son to earn his honor. He wanted him to stand. And he did. As night fell, the battlefield was a graveyard. Thousands of French nobles lay dead or dying. Their banners lay torn in the mud. Their armor, once shining, now dark and broken. Philip VI fled the field, wounded and humiliated. The English losses were small by comparison. Crécy was not just a victory. It was a revelation. For the first time, Europe saw that knights were not invincible. That discipline could defeat nobility. That a common man with a bow could bring down a lord in steel. The old rules of war cracked in a single night. News of the disaster spread across France like wildfire. Nobles whispered in fear. Peasants trembled. The king's authority weakened. England, once dismissed as an inferior rival, now looked terrifyingly dangerous. Edward did not stop. After Crécy, he marched north and laid siege to the port city of Calais. The siege dragged on for nearly a year. The city starved slowly. Rats became food. Leather was boiled and eaten. Children cried themselves to sleep in empty streets. When Calais finally surrendered in 1347, Edward expelled most of its population and filled it with English settlers. Calais became England's doorway into France, a wound that would never fully heal. For a moment, it seemed England had won everything it wanted. But beneath the triumph, something darker was stirring. In 1348, as armies rested and kings counted their victories, a silent enemy arrived from the east. It traveled on ships, in fleas, in breath itself. It crept through ports and cities without banners or warnings. It did not care about crowns or claims. The Black Death had reached Europe, and the war that had begun with kings was about to be reshaped by death itself. The plague did not announce itself with trumpets or banners. It arrived quietly, like a shadow slipping under a door. In the ports of southern Europe, sailors collapsed on the docks. In crowded towns, people woke with fever and pain, dark swellings rising on their necks and under their arms. Within days, they were dead. By the time word reached England and France, it was already too late. The Black Death spread faster than any army, faster than any messenger on horseback, and far more deadly than any sword. For a while, the 100 years, war simply stopped breathing. Kings did not declare truces, but battles faded away because there were no men left to fight them. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay empty, crops rotted where they stood, and roads grew quiet except for funeral carts. In cities, church bells rang so often that people stopped counting the dead. In Paris, bodies were buried in mass graves. In London, the stench of death clung to the air. No one understood what the plague was. Some blamed God. Others blamed poisoned wells, foreign merchants, or the movement of armies themselves. Edward III watched his kingdom suffer like everyone else. Soldiers died in camps. Ships arrived with no living crew. Even the strongest men fell in days. The plague did not care about rank. Lords, priests, merchants, peasants, all died the same way. By the early 1350s, Europe had lost perhaps a third of its population. The world felt broken, hollowed out, quieter than it had ever been. When the plague finally loosened its grip, nothing was the same. The war returned, but it returned to a changed land. Labor was scarce. Fields needed workers. Lords needed tenants. Survivors suddenly found themselves with power they had never known before. Peasants demanded better wages. Soldiers expected higher pay. The old social order began to crack, slowly, painfully. In France, the effects were especially severe. The loss at Crécy still haunted the nobility, and now the plague had shattered the countryside. Taxes rose to fund the war and rebuild defenses. Anger spread among the common people. They felt crushed between foreign invasion, disease, and their own rulers' demands. King Philip VI died in 1350, worn down by failure and grief. His son, John II, took the throne, inheriting not just a crown, but a kingdom full of fear. John II wanted to restore honor to France. He wanted revenge. He wanted to prove that Crécy had been a fluke, that French knights were still the finest warriors in Europe. He reorganized the army, called new banners, and prepared to face England again. Across the Channel, Edward III was just as determined. He believed God had favored him at Crécy, and despite the plague, he he still claimed the French crown as his destiny. The next great clash came in 1356, near a place called Poitiers. Edward's eldest son, now famous as the Black Prince, led the English forces. He was no longer a boy. He was hardened by war, confident, respected, and ruthless when needed. Like his father, he used speed and destruction as weapons, raiding deep into French territory, burning towns, and stripping the land of supplies. The French chased him, determined not to let him escape again. This time, King John II himself led the army. The French forces were massive, far larger than the Black Prince's army. When they finally cornered the English near Poitiers, many believed the outcome would be different from Crécy. The French had learned, or so they thought. They advanced carefully, dismounting many knights to fight on foot. But numbers alone were not enough. The battlefield echoed with familiar sounds. English longbows sang again. Arrows fell like rain. French soldiers advanced under constant fire, struggling across broken ground. The fighting was brutal, close, desperate. Men hacked and shoved, slipping in blood and dust. And then, in the chaos, the unthinkable happened. King John II of France was captured. A king taken alive on the battlefield. It was a disaster beyond words. The French army collapsed in confusion and despair. Thousands died. The Black Prince treated his royal prisoner with respect, dining with him and honoring his rank. But the message was clear. France had lost not just a battle, but its king. John II was taken to England, where he lived in honorable captivity. Meanwhile, France descended into crisis. With the king gone, power fell to his son, the young Dauphin Charles, who struggled to control a kingdom on the edge of collapse. Taxes rose again to pay the enormous ransom demanded by England. Coinage was devalued. Trust in the crown evaporated. In the countryside, anger exploded. In 1358, peasants in northern France rose in violent rebellion. They called it the Jacquerie. Farm workers armed themselves with tools and anger, attacking castles, killing nobles, burning symbols of a system they believed had abandoned them. The rebellion was savage, and it was crushed just as savagely. Thousands of peasants were slaughtered. The message was clear. Order would be restored, no matter the cost. In Paris, unrest simmered as well. Merchants and citizens challenged royal authority, demanding reforms and protection. The Dauphin fought to survive politically, while enemies pressed from all sides. France felt like a kingdom tearing itself apart from within. England watched closely. Edward III now held enormous leverage. With France weakened, divided, and leaderless, he pushed for a settlement that would secure his gains. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretagne was signed. It granted England vast territories in France and a massive ransom for King John's release. In return, Edward agreed at least on paper, to give up his claim to the French crown. For a moment, the war seemed to pause. Edward returned to England triumphant. John II returned to France, humbled and financially ruined. Both kingdoms were exhausted. Fields needed planting. Cities needed rebuilding. People needed peace, but the treaty rested on fragile ground. Promises were delayed. Payments were missed. Local conflicts continued, and beneath the surface, resentment festered. The French never truly accepted the losses. The English never fully trusted the peace. As years passed, a new figure quietly gathered strength in France. The Dauphin, now King Charles V, was not a warrior like his father. He did not dream of glorious charges or shining armor. He believed in patience, strategy, and survival. He watched. He waited. He learned from every English raid and every French mistake. And when the time was right, he would reshape the war in a way no one expected, turning English victories into slow, grinding losses, and proving that the most dangerous battles are not always fought in a single day, but across years of quiet, relentless pressure. When Charles V finally took full control of France, he did so without fanfare. There were no dramatic speeches, no glorious battlefield coronations, no shining armor catching the sun. Instead, there was silence, calculation, and patience. Charles had watched his father humiliated, his kingdom torn apart by plague, rebellion, and foreign invasion. He had learned a hard lesson. France could not beat England by fighting the way England wanted. Knights charging blindly had failed. Pride had failed. Now France would survive by thinking instead of rushing. Charles V was not a physically imposing man. He was often sick, plagued by frail health, and rarely rode into battle himself. But his mind was sharp, focused, and cold when needed. He surrounded himself with skilled advisors and capable commanders, men who understood that winning a war did not always mean winning battles. Sometimes it meant refusing to fight at all. At the heart of this new strategy was a man named Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin did not look like a hero from songs. He was short, broad, rough-faced, and unimpressive at first glance. But he understood warfare in a way few knights did. He believed in ambushes, surprise attacks, and wearing the enemy down slowly. He avoided open battles whenever possible. Instead of seeking glory, he sought results. Under Charles V and Du Guesclin, France changed how it fought the 100 Years' War. Rather than charging English armies head-on, French forces began attacking supply lines, cutting off food, burning bridges, and harassing small units. When the English advanced, the French retreated. When the English stopped, the French struck. Towns loyal to England were isolated and starved. Garrisons were picked apart one by one. It was slow. It was frustrating, but it worked. Edward III, once confident and aggressive, was growing older. fire that had driven him at Crécy and Calais burned lower now. His health declined. His attention drifted back toward England, where politics and finances demanded his time. Much of the fighting in France was now led by his sons, especially the Black Prince. The Black Prince, once a symbol of youthful brilliance, was no longer the same man either. Years of campaigning had taken a toll on his body. He suffered from illness, likely dysentery, leaving him weak and often bedridden. Still, he governed English-held territories in southwestern France, ruling as Prince of Aquitaine. To maintain control, he raised taxes heavily, squeezing the local population to fund continued war. That decision proved disastrous. The people of Aquitaine, once willing to accept English rule, began to resent it deeply. Taxes rose. Justice felt distant. Complaints reached the French court, and Charles V listened carefully. He saw an opportunity not through force, but through law. He summoned the Black Prince to answer these complaints. The prince, insulted, refused. That refusal gave Charles exactly what he needed. In 1369, Charles declared that the Treaty of Bretigny was broken. War resumed officially, but this time, France was ready. Du Guesclin led French forces across the countryside, reclaiming town after town with minimal bloodshed. English strongholds found themselves isolated, surrounded by hostile populations, and cut off from reinforcements. The English tried to respond with raids, but the land no longer offered easy victories. French armies avoided major confrontations. They melted away into forests and hills, returning only when English troops moved on. Villages refused to supply invaders. Roads became traps. The war turned into a slow bleeding wound for England. One by one, English possessions fell. Poitiers returned to French control. Towns in Normandy switched sides. Castles surrendered after long, quiet sieges. The English crown poured money into the war, but the returns grew smaller each year. Soldiers demanded higher wages. Supplies cost more. Parliament grew restless. Meanwhile, tragedy struck the English royal family. In 1376, the Black Prince died, exhausted and broken by years of war and illness. He never became king. His death shocked England deeply. The hero of Crécy and Poitiers was gone, leaving behind a young son, Richard, who was only 10 years old. The following year, in 1377, Edward III himself died. With his death, an era ended. The English throne passed to Richard II, a child surrounded by ambitious nobles and political tension. England was suddenly led by a boy, while still fighting a long, expensive war across the sea. The unity and confidence that Edward III had built began to fracture. France sensed the shift immediately. Charles V pressed harder, but still carefully. He avoided reckless advances. he focused on stability, taxation reform, and strengthening royal authority. By the time he died in 1380, much of France had been reclaimed. England still held some territory, but its dominance was gone. The balance had shifted. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the war might fade away. Both kingdoms were exhausted. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. People longed for rest, but peace did not come. Charles V's son, Charles VI, inherited the throne at just 11 years old. At first, France was governed by regents, powerful uncles who fought among themselves for influence. When Charles VI came of age, he appeared strong and charismatic, a symbol of renewed hope. Then suddenly, everything collapsed. In 1392, Charles VI suffered a terrifying mental breakdown. During a march, he attacked his own men, killing several before being restrained. After that day, his mind was never the same. At times, he believed he was made of glass. At other times, he did not recognize his wife or children. France once again found itself with a king who could not rule. Power fractured between rival factions. The royal court split into bitter camps, each blaming the other for France's suffering. Violence returned, not from England, but from within. England, though weakened, watched closely. Richard II proved an unstable ruler. He clashed with his nobles, ruled harshly, and lost their trust. In 1399, he was overthrown by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became King Henry IV. England had changed kings, not through inheritance, but force. That single act planted seeds of insecurity that would haunt the English crown for decades. For a time, both kingdoms were too busy tearing themselves apart to fight each other openly. The 100 Years' War slowed, but it did not die. It waited like an old wound that never fully heals. And then, in the early 1400s, a new English king would rise, young, ambitious, and desperate to prove his legitimacy. A king who believed that victory in France could unite England behind him. A king who would gamble everything on one brutal campaign. His name was Henry V, and with him, the war would roar back to life louder and bloodier than ever before. Henry V did not inherit a secure throne. He seized it from uncertainty. His father, Henry IV, had taken the crown by force, overthrowing Richard II, and that shadow never left the family. Rebellion simmered across England. Nobles questioned loyalty. Common people whispered about legitimacy. Henry V understood something deeply important. England needed a cause bigger than its internal divisions. It needed a shared enemy, a shared dream, and a shared victory. France offered all three. Henry V was not reckless. He was disciplined, intelligent, deeply religious, and coldly practical. He reformed the army, enforced strict order, punished looting, and demanded obedience. He He wanted his soldiers to see themselves not as raiders, but as instruments of destiny. Before crossing the Channel, he made his claim clear. He was not invading France as a pirate king. He was reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. In 1415, Henry V sailed for France. His target was the port city of Harfleur, a key gateway into Normandy. The siege began under summer heat, with disease spreading fast through the English camp. Dysentery ravaged the soldiers. Men weakened, collapsed, and died in their tents. Supplies ran low. Time slipped away. Every day, Henry remained outside Harfleur increased the risk of a massive French army arriving to crush him. But Henry did not retreat. When Harfleur finally surrendered, the victory felt hollow. His army was exhausted and badly reduced. Many commanders urged him to return to England. Instead, Henry made a dangerous choice. He would march his weakened army across northern France to Calais, an English-held port, daring the French to stop him. The French did not disappoint. They gathered one of the largest armies France had assembled in decades. Nobles eager for revenge filled the ranks. They believed Henry's force was trapped, starving, and doomed. French confidence returned with a vengeance. They would destroy the English king in open battle and end the war in one decisive stroke. The two armies met near a muddy stretch of land called Agincourt. On October 25, 1415, rain fell heavily. The field turned into thick, clinging mud. Forests hemmed in both sides, narrowing the battlefield. Henry placed his longbowmen on the flanks, protected by sharpened wooden stakes driven into the ground. His men-at-arms stood in the center, fewer in number, but tightly packed. The French army was massive, glittering with armor and banners. Knights crowded forward, confident in their numbers. They believed this battle would be a slaughter. They believed God favored them. When the fighting began, it unfolded with terrifying speed. English longbowmen unleashed their arrows, thousands upon thousands, raining death onto the advancing French. The knights charged, but the mud slowed them. Horses stumbled. Men fell and could not rise. Armor became a prison, dragging bodies down into the muck. The narrow field compressed the French advance, forcing them into a deadly crush. The English surged forward. Men fought face to face, choking, slipping, screaming. French knights fell on top of each other, unable to move, suffocating beneath the weight of their own armor and fallen comrades. The longbowmen dropped their bows and joined the fight with axes, knives, and hammers. It was not a noble battle. It was a brutal one. When it ended, the field was covered with bodies. Thousands of French nobles were dead or captured. Entire noble families were wiped out in a single morning. The English losses were shockingly small by comparison. Henry V had done the impossible. He had crushed a vastly superior army with discipline, terrain, and ruthless clarity. Agincourt sent shockwaves through Europe. France was stunned. England erupted in celebration. Henry returned home as a living legend, hailed as God's chosen king. Songs were written. Stories grew larger with every telling. But Henry did not linger in triumph. He knew Agincourt was not the end. It was the opening blow of a new phase of the war. Over the next years, Henry returned to France again and again. This time, he did not rely on raids. He conquered methodically, town by town, castle by castle. Normandy fell steadily into English hands. French resistance weakened, not just from military defeat, but from internal collapse. France was tearing itself apart. King Charles VI was still alive, but his madness ruled the kingdom. Rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fought a brutal civil war. Streets in Paris ran with blood. Assassinations became common. Loyalty meant nothing. Survival meant everything. Henry V exploited this perfectly. He allied himself with the Burgundians, turning French against French. With their support, he marched into Paris. In 1420, the unthinkable happened. The Treaty of Troyes was signed. It declared Henry V the heir to the French throne. He married Catherine of Valois, the French king's daughter. The Dauphin, Charles, was disinherited and declared illegitimate. On paper, the 100 Years' War was over. Henry V would become King of England and France. Two crowns united. Two kingdoms under one ruler. But reality was far more fragile. Many in France rejected the treaty. They saw it as betrayal, forced by madness and civil war. The Dauphin Charles fled south, clinging to a shrinking base of support. He was mocked as weak, cowardly, and unworthy. Even his own allies doubted him. Then fate intervened. In 1422, Henry V fell ill. Within weeks, he was dead. He was only 35 years old. Just months later, Charles VI of France also died. The crowns of England and France passed to Henry's infant son, Henry VI, a baby less than a year old. England was ruled by regents. France was split between those loyal to the child king and those loyal to the rejected Dauphin. Once again, the war refused to end. England still held much of northern France, including Paris, but the fire that Henry V had carried burned out with him. His generals were capable, but none possessed his authority. Discipline weakened. Unity cracked. The English grip on France began to loosen slowly, quietly. In the south, the Dauphin Charles struggled to survive. He lacked money, confidence, and respect. Many believed his cause was doomed, that France would eventually accept English rule simply because there was no other choice. And then, in a small village far from courts and battlefields, a teenage girl began to hear voices. Voices that told her France was not finished yet. Voices that would drag kings, armies, and history itself toward a turning point no one could have imagined. The girl was born into a world already broken by war. Her village, Domremy, sat quietly on the edge of French territory, surrounded by fields that had been trampled too many times by passing armies. She was not noble. She was not educated. She could not read or write. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, and nothing about her life suggested she would change the course of history. Yet, history does not always announce itself with power. Sometimes it arrives barefoot, carrying a conviction so strong it bends reality around it. From a young age, Jeanne believed she heard voices. They came to her, she said, in moments of stillness. Saints spoke to her. They told her that France was suffering because it had lost its way. They told her that God had chosen her to save it. At first, she kept these visions to herself, but as the war dragged on and the English tightened their grip, the voices grew more urgent. They told her the Dauphin must be crowned king. They told her she must lead him to that destiny. France, at this point, was on the edge of disappearance. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled Paris and most of northern France. The Dauphin Charles ruled only a shrinking patch of land in the south. His court moved constantly, fearful and unsure. Many doubted he was the rightful king. Others doubted he was even capable of being one. His enemies mocked him as the king of Bourgs, a ruler of almost nothing. The English advanced slowly but relentlessly. Their next target was Orleans, a strategic city on the Loire River. If Orleans fell, the south of France would be exposed. The Dauphin's last defenses would crumble. Everyone understood this. Orleans became a symbol. If it fell, France would fall with it. By late 1428, Orleans was under siege. The city endured hunger, fear, and constant bombardment. English artillery thundered day and night. Supplies ran dangerously low. Hope drained away with each passing week. Many believed it was only a matter of time before surrender became inevitable. It was during this darkest moment that Jeanne left her village. She traveled through hostile territory, dressed as a man for safety, carrying nothing but conviction. She demanded an audience with the Dauphin. At first, she was laughed at. A peasant girl claiming divine guidance sounded like madness in a court already drowning in desperation. But Jeanne refused to leave. She spoke with calm certainty. She told Charles details of his private prayers, things she could not possibly know. Curiosity turned into unease. Unease turned into belief. After months of testing, questioning, and delay, Charles made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. He gave Jeanne armor, he gave her a banner, and he sent her to Orleans. In April 1429, Jeanne entered the city. The effect was immediate and electric. People who had been starving and terrified suddenly stood taller. Soldiers who had avoided combat now rushed to their posts. Jean did not fight like a knight. She carried no sword into battle. She carried a banner painted with holy symbols, riding at the front, urging men forward, demanding action. She spoke of faith, of courage, of destiny. And strangely, impossibly, men listened. Within days, the French attacked. They struck English fortifications one by one. Jean was wounded by an arrow, but returned to the field, bloodied but unbroken. Her presence seemed to defy fear itself. On May 8, 1429, the English lifted the siege and retreated. Orleans was free. Across France, the news spread like wildfire. The impossible had happened. A city everyone believed was lost had been saved. Not by a seasoned general, not by a noble prince, but by a teenage girl guided by faith. Soldiers began to believe again. Peasants whispered her name. The Dauphin, once doubted and mocked, now seemed touched by divine favor. Jean did not stop. She pushed Charles to act quickly. Victory, she warned, was fragile. Momentum could vanish if they hesitated. She urged him to march north, through enemy territory, to Reims, the traditional site where French kings were crowned. Many advisors objected. The road was dangerous. The risk was enormous. Jean insisted. Charles listened. As the army moved north, towns opened their gates without resistance. English garrisons fled. Burgundian allies hesitated. It was as if the war itself had changed direction. Battles were won quickly, sometimes without fighting at all. The French army moved with a confidence it had not known in decades. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France in Reims Cathedral. Jean stood nearby, weeping. For her, the mission was complete. The voices had told her this moment would come. France had its king. The future was still uncertain, but something essential had been restored. Legitimacy, hope, identity. But war does not end because of hope alone. After the coronation, Jean's influence began to fade. Charles, now king, grew cautious. His advisors feared Jean's power and popularity. They worried she might become uncontrollable. Negotiations with the Burgundians resumed. Momentum slowed. Jean grew frustrated. She believed the war must be finished decisively. Charles believed patience was safer. The split proved fatal. In 1430, Jean led a small force to defend the town of Compiègne. During a skirmish, she was thrown from her horse and captured by Burgundian soldiers. They sold her to the English. Her trial was not about justice. It was about erasing a symbol. The English placed Jean on trial for heresy. They accused her of witchcraft, of blasphemy, of dressing as a man. The court was rigged. The outcome decided before it began. Jean faced her judges with remarkable calm. She answered questions simply, honestly, without fear. When threatened with torture, she did not break. Still, she was condemned. On May 30, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was burned alive in Rouen. She was 19 years old. As the flames rose, witnesses said she called out the name of Jesus. Her ashes were thrown into the river, so no relics could remain. The English believed her death would break French morale. They were wrong. Jeanne's execution transformed her from a leader into a legend. Her story spread faster than any army. She became proof that France was worth fighting for, worth suffering for. Charles VII, once weak and doubted, slowly rebuilt his power. He reorganized the army, improved artillery, and reduced the influence of unruly nobles. He learned from Jeanne's courage and from earlier failures. The war was not over, but the tide had turned. England still held territory. Paris was still contested, but something fundamental had changed. The English were no longer advancing. They were defending, retreating, losing ground inch by inch. And as years passed, cannon would replace arrows, discipline would replace chivalry, and the final chapters of the 100 Years, war would approach, not with a single great battle, but with the slow, relentless collapse of English rule in France. After Jeanne d'Arc's death, the world did not suddenly grow quiet. There was no pause for mourning, no respectful silence between enemies. War rarely offers such kindness, but something had changed deep beneath the noise of marching boots and clashing steel. The English still held strong positions in France, but their confidence had been shaken. They had burned a girl, yet her shadow seemed to grow larger with every passing year. Charles VII moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who had learned the cost of rushing. He did not try to copy Jeanne's fire. Instead, he absorbed her lesson. France needed belief, yes, but belief supported by structure, money, and discipline. For decades, French armies had been collections of nobles chasing personal glory. Charles ended that. He began building something new, a royal army loyal not to individual lords, but to the crown itself. This was revolutionary. For the first time, France invested seriously in standing forces. Soldiers were paid regularly. Command chains were tightened. Mercenaries were controlled instead of unleashed. Artillery became a priority. Cannon were no longer rare curiosities. They became central weapons. Stone walls that had stood for centuries suddenly felt fragile. England, meanwhile, began to unravel from within. Henry VI grew into a gentle, deeply religious man, utterly unsuited for war or politics. He lacked his father's authority and his grandfather's strength. England was ruled by regents and factions, each pulling in different directions. Money ran dry. Parliament resisted new taxes. Soldiers in France went unpaid, undisciplined, and resentful. Garrisons weakened. Loyalty faded. The Burgundians, once England's greatest allies, watched this decline carefully. In 1435, a diplomatic earthquake struck. Treaty of Arras was signed between France and Burgundy. Burgundy abandoned England and recognized Charles VII as the rightful king of France. Paris, once lost, opened its gates to French forces shortly after. England had lost its most powerful ally. From that moment on, English rule in France began to crumble like wet parchment. One town after another fell back into French hands. Sometimes there were battles. Sometimes there were negotiations. Often there was simply surrender. Local populations no longer believed England could protect them. They chose survival over loyalty. French artillery reshaped warfare. Cannons smashed castle walls that arrows and swords never could. English strongholds, once symbols of dominance, became traps. Siege after siege ended quickly, decisively. The longbow, once England's greatest advantage, began to lose its power in a world ruled by gunpowder. Still, the English fought on. Veteran commanders clung to tradition. Soldiers remembered Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. They believed those victories could happen again. But the conditions were gone. France was united. England was divided. The war that once favored daring now favored patience and resources. In 1444, a temporary truce was signed. For a moment, it seemed peace might finally come. Henry VI even married Margaret of Anjou, a French noblewoman, sealing the agreement. But the peace was fragile, built on exhaustion rather than resolution. It did not last. When fighting resumed, it was clear who held the advantage. French armies advanced with confidence, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. The English were pushed steadily westward, clinging desperately to Normandy and Gascony, their last meaningful territories. In 1450, Normandy was lost. The shock in England was immense. Normandy had been English for generations. Families had lived there for centuries. Its loss felt like a piece of England itself had been torn away. Anger turned inward. Rebellions broke out. The crown's authority weakened further. Henry VI collapsed mentally, suffering episodes of complete withdrawal. England drifted leaderless. Powerful nobles began preparing for conflict, not with France, but with each other. France sensed the end approaching. Only Gascony remained, centered around the city of Bordeaux. The region had long ties to England and initially resisted French control. When French forces captured Bordeaux in 1451, the city briefly returned to English hands after a local uprising. England sent one last army, one last hope. The final confrontation came in 1453 near the town of Castellan. This time, the battlefield told a new story. French artillery was positioned carefully behind earthworks. Cannons stood ready, silent, and deadly. The English charged, believing courage could still overcome firepower. It could not. Cannon roared. Iron tore through ranks. before they could even reach the enemy. The English commander, John Talbot, one of the last great veterans of the war, was killed. The battle was short. It was decisive. With Castellan, English rule in France ended. Bordeaux surrendered soon after. The 100 Years' War was over, though no treaty formally declared it so. After 116 years of fighting, England was left with only one possession on the continent, the port of Calais. Everything else was gone. France stood exhausted, but united. England stood defeated and unstable. The war that had begun over a disputed crown ended by reshaping two nations entirely. France emerged with a stronger monarchy, a national identity forged in suffering, and a modern army. England turned inward, consumed by political chaos that would soon erupt into the Wars of the Roses. But the echoes of the 100 Years' War did not fade easily. The fields where men had died remained scarred. Families remembered losses across generations. Stories of longbows, burning villages, and a girl with a banner passed into legend. The war had changed how people fought, how kings ruled, and how nations understood themselves. And even though the fighting had ended, the consequences were only beginning. Because when a century of war finally stops, it leaves behind not peace, but questions about power, loyalty, and the cost of ambition. That would shape Europe for centuries to come, long after the last arrow was fired. When the fighting finally faded, silence did not bring relief. It brought confusion. For more than a century, war had been the constant background noise of life. Children were born into it, grew up inside it, and died without ever knowing a world at peace. Now, suddenly, the armies were gone. The banners were lowered. The roads grew quiet, and people were left staring at the ruins, asking what all of it had been for. In France, the land itself looked wounded. Villages lay half abandoned, fields untended, churches damaged or stripped bare to pay ransoms and taxes. Generations of men had vanished. Some died in battle. Others never returned from distant campaigns. Whole family lines ended without ceremony. Widows ran farms. Orphans begged in towns. The war had taken far more than territory. It had taken time, memory, and innocence. Yet France had survived. Charles VII, once mocked and doubted, now ruled a united kingdom. He understood that victory meant nothing if the nation collapsed afterward. Slowly, carefully, he rebuilt royal authority. The standing army he created did not disappear when the war ended. It became permanent. Artillery remained under royal control. Local warlords were disarmed. For the first time, France began to resemble a modern state rather than a collection of feuding nobles. Taxes, once chaotic and resented, were reorganized. Infrastructure was repaired. Trade slowly returned. The crown asserted its presence everywhere, not through fear alone, but through order. The The memory of Jeanne d'Arc lingered like a quiet promise. She became a symbol not just of faith, but of France itself, wounded, defiant, and unbroken. England's story was darker. The defeat in France felt humiliating, but it was only the beginning of England's pain. The war had drained the treasury, weakened the monarchy, and empowered rival noble families. Soldiers returned home unemployed and angry. Taxes remained high despite the loss of overseas lands. Trust in the crown evaporated. Henry VI, fragile and indecisive, could not hold the kingdom together. The result was inevitable. Civil war erupted almost immediately. The Wars of the Roses tore England apart, pitting noble houses against one another in brutal struggles for power. Battles once fought in French fields were now fought on English soil. The lessons of the 100 Years, war discipline, artillery, organization, were turned inward. Englishmen killed Englishmen with the same efficiency they once used against foreign enemies. In a cruel twist, England became the battlefield it once tried to escape by fighting abroad. Meanwhile, across Europe, rulers studied what had happened. They learned that knights in shining armor were no longer the future, that castles could fall to cannon, that kings who relied on noble pride instead of professional armies would lose. The 100 Years' War became a long, bloody classroom for the modern world. National identity itself changed. Before the war, loyalty often belonged to local lords, regions, or families. After it, people began to think of themselves as French or English in a deeper sense. Language mattered more. Borders mattered more. The idea of a nation, rather than a ruler, took root. Even memory changed. Songs were written about Agincourt and Orleans. Stories exaggerated victories and softened defeats. Heroes grew larger than life. Villains became simpler. History blurred into legend. The war became a source of pride, shame, warning, and inspiration, depending on who told the story. Yet, beneath the myths, the truth remained heavy. The 100 Years' War was not one war, but many. It was fought by different generations, for different reasons, under different kings, who often barely remembered how it had begun. What started as a dynastic dispute over a crown ended as a struggle for survival, identity, and control. And still, its shadow stretched forward. France would never forget the terror of invasion. England would never forget the dream of continental power. Distrust lingered across the Channel, shaping diplomacy and rivalry for centuries. The memory of burning towns and foreign soldiers never fully faded. Even Jeanne d'Arc's legacy continued to evolve. Decades after her death, her trial was re-examined. She was declared innocent. Centuries later, she would be canonized as a saint. But long before that, she lived in the minds of ordinary people as proof that history could turn on the smallest, strangest forces. a peasant girl, a voice, a banner raised against impossible odds. The war had proven that kings could fall, treaties could fail, and armies could vanish. But belief could endure. And as Europe moved slowly toward the Renaissance, toward new ideas and new conflicts, the lessons of the 100 Years' War remained buried beneath stone walls, written into scars on the land, and whispered in stories told by firesides. Because wars do not truly end when fighting stops. They end when people stop remembering them, and the 100 Years' War would be remembered for a very long time. Long after the last English soldiers left French soil, the war continued to live inside people's minds, shaping how they understood power, fear, and survival. In villages rebuilt from ashes, elders told children about nights when armor clanked outside their doors and fires lit the horizon. These were not heroic tales. They were warnings. The 100 Years' War had taught ordinary people that kings could argue over crowns, while peasants paid the price, and that loyalty could shift overnight when armies arrived. Memory became a quiet force, passed down through tone and silence rather than words. In France, Charles VII aged into his victory. He ruled longer than anyone expected, cautious even in success. The standing army remained his greatest legacy. Soldiers were no longer seasonal guests who arrived to loot and left destruction behind. They were professionals, accountable to the crown. Artillery schools expanded. Foundries worked steadily. Roads and supply lines mattered as much as bravery. War had become organized, calculated, and increasingly distant from chivalric fantasy. The knight, once the center of battle, became a supporting figure in a world ruled by cannon and command. The nobility resisted at first. Many hated losing their private armies and local authority, but the memory of defeat kept them quiet. France had nearly vanished once. No one wanted to return to that edge. Over time, the monarchy's grip tightened, not through constant violence, but through systems that made rebellion expensive and unity profitable. The war had taught France the value of central power, and it would never fully forget that lesson. England, meanwhile, descended deeper into chaos. The Wars of the Roses consumed nearly every noble house. Brothers fought brothers. Fathers turned against sons. The same longbows and tactics once used at Agincourt were now used at Towton and Bosworth. The irony was bitter. England had lost France, but gained something far worse: internal war without a foreign enemy to blame. The crown changed hands again and again, each transfer soaked in blood. To many English commoners, France became a distant dream, half remembered and half mythical. Calais stood alone as a reminder of what once was. Veterans spoke of vineyards and foreign towns, of victories that no longer mattered. Taxes still rose. Life was still hard, promised rewards of empire never arrived. Slowly, England turned inward, focusing on survival rather than expansion. Across Europe, rulers studied these outcomes closely. The Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and emerging powers all absorbed the same message. Medieval warfare was obsolete. Feudal levies were unreliable. Noble pride was dangerous. Money, training, and centralized control decided wars now. The 100 Years' War became a reference point, cited in councils, and whispered in courts as proof of what happened when old systems refused to change. The church, too, had been altered. During the war, popes and bishops had taken sides, blessed armies, justified violence. Afterward, many questioned that authority. Faith remained powerful, but it became more personal, less blindly obedient. Jean D'Arc's story complicated everything. She was both condemned and vindicated, both heretic and saint. Her existence challenged who had the right to speak for God, and that question would echo loudly in the centuries to come. Economically, the war reshaped land ownership. In France, abandoned estates were absorbed by the crown or new families. In England, nobles ruined by war sold lands to survive, allowing merchants and lesser gentry to rise. The rigid medieval class structure loosened, not enough to create equality, but enough to crack the old order. Money mattered more than lineage now. Skill mattered more than birth. These changes moved slowly, but they moved steadily. Culturally, the idea of honor transformed. The image of a knight charging into battle for glory faded. Survival replaced spectacle. Writers and chroniclers began describing war not as noble sport, but as tragedy. They wrote of suffering, of broken homes, of moral cost. The romance of endless war lost its shine. People began to ask whether victory was worth the damage it left behind. Yet, even with all this reflection, resentment never fully disappeared. Across the Channel, distrust lingered. French victories did not erase centuries of English claims. English defeat did not erase centuries of ambition. Each generation inherited a quieter version of the same rivalry, embedded in diplomacy, trade disputes, and political suspicion. The war had ended, but its emotional residue remained. Time passed, faces changed, but the land remembered. Battlefields returned to farms, yet plows still struck rusted armor. Rivers that once carried bodies flowed calmly again, but fishermen whispered about ghosts. Castles turned into residences or ruins, silent witnesses to a past no one fully understood anymore. The war became history, then legend, then distant memory. But it never vanished completely, because the 100 Years' War was not just about France and England. It was about the death of one world and the birth of another. A world where kings ruled through systems, not swords, where war demanded industry, not just courage, identity stretched beyond village and lured to something larger and more dangerous: the nation. Everything that followed in Europe, from empire building to revolution, carried traces of this transformation. And as the medieval age slowly gave way to the early modern world, the echoes of the 100 Years' War remained embedded in its foundations, shaping conflicts yet to come, preparing the stage for struggles far larger than any crown dispute could ever explain. Even decades after the final cannon fire at Castellan, the echoes of the 100 Years' War continued to ripple across the lands of France and England, touching the lives of kings and peasants alike, shaping the very identity of nations in ways that would last for centuries. In France, the war had left a scar deeper than any stone wall could bear. Cities like Orleans and Reims had endured sieges that tore apart communities. Yet they also became symbols of resilience and hope. Villagers rebuilt their homes, not simply with wood and stone, but with a new understanding of endurance, of survival against overwhelming odds. The countryside, once trampled and littered with broken armor, and the remnants of thousands of fallen men, slowly healed. Fields grew green again, vineyards returned to life, and towns that had been devastated slowly began to prosper. Though memories of famine and occupation lingered like ghosts in every corner, France had survived the war, but survival had come at an enormous cost. The kingdom had lost entire generations of men, entire families were gone, and countless lives had been changed forever by the relentless cruelty of conflict. The monarchy, which had seemed so vulnerable at the start of the war, emerged transformed. Charles VII, who had once been ridiculed as the King of Bourgs, proved that patience and strategy could overcome brute force. He left a kingdom more centralized than any France had known. The standing army he had created endured even beyond his reign, a permanent institution that ensured the crown's authority over rebellious nobles. Taxes were reorganized, justice systems were strengthened, and the power of local lords was curtailed. In doing so, Charles VII set the stage for a French state that would continue to consolidate power and authority in the decades that followed. France, battered and weary, emerged stronger than before, not through battlefield heroics alone, but through discipline, organization, and a long, patient understanding of what true power required. Yet the cost of victory was not measured merely in political reform or military innovation. The human toll remained staggering. Countless widows, orphans, and displaced peasants lived with the invisible scars of the war. Families mourned the men who had disappeared on distant battlefields, leaving farms untended and towns depopulated. Villages still bore the mark of sieges. Homes burned to the ground, churches stripped bare, fields abandoned for years. Those who survived carried the memories like shadows. a daily reminder that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of healing, a task far more complex than any treaty could accomplish. In England, the story was darker and more chaotic. The loss of French territory, culminating in the fall of Bordeaux, and the end of English ambitions on the continent, left the kingdom politically fragile and deeply divided. The crown's authority weakened, and internal rivalries exploded into the Wars of the Roses. Noble families, embittered by years of war and frustrated by lack of opportunity, turned their swords on each other, plunging England into decades of internal bloodshed. Henry VI, the gentle and pious king who had inherited the throne as an infant, proved incapable of managing the volatile politics of his realm. His mental instability further fueled the turmoil, leaving a kingdom torn apart by ambition and resentment. England, once a confident and aggressive power on the European stage, retreated inward, consumed by the struggles of its own fractured nobility. Its dreams of empire on the continent were replaced by the grim reality of civil war. The 100 Years' War also reshaped military strategy in ways that would reverberate far beyond its immediate battles. The era of the knight in shining armor charging into battle for glory was fading. Massed infantry, disciplined archers, and the growing importance of artillery proved decisive. Castles and fortified towns, once nearly impregnable, were vulnerable to cannon fire. Kings learned that loyalty could not be assumed, that professional soldiers who were paid, trained, and disciplined were far more effective than feudal levies who fought only for brief periods or personal advantage. The lessons of Agincourt, Orleans, and Castellan were studied across Europe for generations. Future rulers understood that the nature of war had fundamentally changed. Courage alone could not secure victory. Strategy, preparation, and organization now mattered more than individual valor. Jeanne d'Arc's story, in particular, transcended her own time. Though she died at 19, executed by the English in Rouen, her legend became immortal. She was not only a military leader, but also a symbol of national resilience and divine inspiration. Her ability to inspire men and shift the momentum of war with nothing but conviction and courage left an indelible mark on French identity. She was canonized centuries later, but long before that, she lived in the collective memory of a people who had endured unimaginable hardship and emerged with their nation intact. Jeanne showed that the smallest, seemingly weakest voices could have the power to change history. She proved that war was not just a clash of armies, but also a battle of belief, morale, and inspiration. Economically, the war reshaped both kingdoms. In France, devastated lands required decades to recover. Reconstruction demanded investment and labor. Estates changed hands as old noble lines were wiped out or financially ruined. New wealth shifted to the emerging merchant class, especially in towns that had prospered by supplying armies or trading during wartime. In England, the financial strain of decades of war, combined with civil unrest, disrupted trade and local economies. Nobles sold off lands to cover debts, opening opportunities for merchants and lesser gentry. Both kingdoms saw a subtle but irreversible shift in power. Money and organization began to matter more than birthright and inherited prestige. Culturally, the war left a profound imprint. Chroniclers began to record not only battles, but also suffering. Songs and poems, once filled with tales of heroic knights, began to emphasize tragedy, endurance, and moral cost. The romance of war faded, replaced by an awareness that conflict came at immense human price. Townspeople remembered burned homes, stolen food, and conscription. And these memories shaped literature, art, and storytelling for generations. Even centuries later, the battles, sieges, and heroics of the 100 Years' War would appear in plays, ballads, and chronicles, reminding people that victory was never free. The geopolitical consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. France, having solidified its national identity, would become a dominant power in Europe, capable of projecting authority, raising armies, and asserting influence for centuries. England, weakened by failure abroad and civil war at home, turned increasingly toward maritime trade, eventually setting its sights beyond Europe. The war had drawn both nations onto paths that would define their destinies long after the last cannon fell silent. And yet, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the 100 Years' War was psychological. For generations, men and women had lived with the uncertainty of life, property, and power. The war had shown that rulers could be ineffective, armies could collapse, and fortunes could be lost overnight. Yet it had also shown that resilience, strategy, and unity could restore what seemed lost forever. The war had created a sense of identity, not just in kings and nobles, but among ordinary people. Villagers, merchants, soldiers, and priests all shared the memory of endurance, the story of survival, and the legend of figures like Jeanne d'Arc, whose courage reminded everyone that the fate of a nation could hinge on the determination of one person. By the mid-15th century, Europe was changing. Feudal structures weakened. Armies grew professional. Cannon and gunpowder transformed sieges. Nations began to emerge from the chaos of medieval conflict, reshaping borders, identities, and governments. The 100 Years' War, which had seemed endless, had become the crucible that forged the modern nation-state. Its battles, sieges, and heroics echoed through history, teaching lessons about strategy, leadership, endurance, and the profound costs of war. And so, as the smoke of the last battles cleared, and the the generations who had lived through the war passed into memory. Europe slowly turned its gaze toward the future. Kings, soldiers, and peasants alike knew the truth. The world had changed forever. Armies would march again. Thrones would be contested again. But the lessons of the 100 Years, war, the power of patience, the impact of leadership, the fragility of ambition, and the enduring strength of belief would never be forgotten. The war had ended, yet it remained alive in every stone, every story, and every whispered memory. A reminder that history is not just written by victors, but by those who endure to see the dawn after the longest night, even after the formal end of the 100 Years' war. The aftermath stretched across France and England like a shadow too long to escape. For generations, the land bore the visible and invisible scars of a conflict that had lasted over a century. Fields where farmers once plowed now held shallow graves. Forests, once alive with wildlife, had been cleared to feed armies. Towns bore the marks of repeated sieges, their walls pockmarked with cannon fire, their churches stripped bare of gold and relics. Survivors walked among the ruins of a world that had been permanently altered. Every village, every city, every stretch of road carried echoes of marching soldiers, of sieges, of hunger and death. Yet life returned slowly, like water filling a dried riverbed. And with it came new patterns, new systems, and new rules born of necessity and experience. In France, the monarchy began to consolidate power in ways that would shape the country for centuries. Charles VII, mindful of the lessons learned during the war, invested heavily in central authority. He retained the standing army he had created during wartime. Understanding that a permanent, disciplined military was not just for defending borders, but also for asserting the king's influence over rebellious nobles. Castles, once centers of independent power, were brought under tighter royal control, and local militias were absorbed into the crown's authority. Administrative reforms followed. Taxation became more organized, less arbitrary, and more consistent. Legal systems were reformed to provide stability in a country that had been riddled with local disputes, feuds, and lawlessness during the conflict. France, exhausted yet unified, had emerged stronger than ever, its identity reshaped not by rhetoric, but by fire, loss, and survival. But rebuilding was neither swift nor easy. The countryside, still recovering from years of invasion, siege, and famine, required immense effort to restore productivity. Many towns had lost most of their men to battle or disease, leaving women and the elderly to maintain farms and workshops. Abandoned estates were seized by the crown or purchased by wealthier citizens, creating a shift in land ownership that slowly eroded the old feudal hierarchy. Merchants and minor nobles, once peripheral figures, began to wield more influence. A subtle yet irreversible change in the social fabric of France. The 100 Years' War had not just altered borders, it had altered the way people lived, worked, and thought about authority. England's story, by contrast, descended into chaos after the war's end. The defeat in France had not only stripped England of its continental holdings, but also exposed weaknesses in the monarchy itself. Henry VI, gentle and devout, but politically inept, lacked the charisma and decisiveness required to hold a fractured kingdom together. His mental instability, combined with the resentment and ambition of powerful noble families, created a powder keg. What followed were the Wars of the Roses, a civil conflict that would tear England apart for decades. Bloodlines that had once been the proud defenders of the crown became rivals, clashing in battles that mirrored the intensity of the war across the Channel, but with far less cause or purpose. England had lost its empire abroad, and now it lost itself at home. The war had also permanently transformed the nature of military conflict in Europe. Armies were no longer composed mainly of knights and feudal levies who fought for honor or short-term payment. Professional soldiers, disciplined, trained, and organized under centralized command, became essential. Longbows, once the decisive weapon of English dominance, were gradually replaced by artillery. Cannon became central to warfare, capable of shattering walls and fortresses that had once seemed impregnable. Sieges, rather than pitched battles, now determined the fate of kingdoms. Leaders learned that success was no longer about personal heroics or the valor of a few knights, but about logistics, strategy, and the efficient mobilization of men, resources, and technology. The war had forced nations to modernize, whether they wished to or not. Yet, for all its political, social, and military lessons, the war's human cost remained immense. France had lost countless men, many of whom were conscripted from villages and towns to fight battles that stretched for miles and years. Entire families were wiped out. Communities were hollowed. England, too, had lost a generation to battle and disease, leaving a legacy of grief and trauma. Survivors carried invisible wounds, stories of hunger, fear, and violence that could never fully be erased. Chroniclers of the era wrote of suffering alongside heroism, recording tales not only of victories, but of starvation, disease, and betrayal. Literature and folklore absorbed the war, shaping collective memory and national identity. Stories of Agincourt and Orleans became mythic, not just for the battles themselves, but for the endurance, hope, and suffering intertwined with them. Jeanne d'Arc's legend persisted, transcending her death to become both a national symbol and a moral lesson. Even after her execution, she remained alive in the consciousness of the French people as proof that courage and conviction could alter the course of history. Her ability to inspire men, shift the momentum of war against overwhelming odds, provided an enduring example of individual influence amid chaos. She reminded France that hope could exist even in the darkest hours, that the voices of the small and the overlooked could defy entire armies and reshape destinies. Her martyrdom only strengthened her image, turning her into a symbol of faith, resilience, and the possibility of divine favor in human affairs. Across Europe, the lessons of the war reverberated in political thought and diplomacy. Monarchs, diplomats, and military leaders observed the rise and fall of territories and the consolidation of power. They learned that divided leadership, weak administration, and factional disputes could lead to disaster. They learned that war could transform societies as profoundly as treaties, that discipline and organization could overcome raw bravery, and that technology, like cannon and gunpowder, could render centuries-old methods obsolete. In many ways, the 100 Years' War served as a precursor to the early modern era, where states became more centralized, armies professionalized, and warfare more systematic and deadly. Yet, despite all these transformations, the human spirit endured. Markets reopened. Fields grew crops again. Families rebuilt what they could. Monuments, cathedrals, and homes rose from ruins. In the quiet hours between battles, between political turmoil, and between shifting power, ordinary people carried the memory of the war in their hearts, passing it down in stories, songs, and whispers. The past remained alive, haunting and instructive, a testament to resilience amid devastation. Even the cultural identity of nations had been reshaped. France, emerging from the war, began to think of itself as a single entity rather than a collection of feudal territories. Language, law, and loyalty coalesced around the crown. England, though weakened, began to develop a consciousness of itself as a people distinct from its former ambitions in France. The 100 Years' War, while concluded, had created the frameworks for modern national identity. It had shown that wars could define nations as much as borders, that suffering and victory alike could forge collective memory, and that the stories of a century-long conflict could outlast the lives of kings, generals, and common soldiers alike. And as decades turned into centuries, historians, chroniclers, and scholars continued to study its lessons, dissect its failures, and celebrate its triumphs. They understood that the 100 Years' War was not merely a series of battles over crowns and territories. It was a crucible that tested human endurance, ingenuity, and spirit. It transformed warfare, redefined authority, shaped economies, and created legends. Its influence rippled through time, reminding Europe that history is not simply written by victories and treaties, but by the endurance of those who live through its trials, who rebuild, who remember, and who pass their stories forward, ensuring that the cost, the courage, and the consequences of a century of war are never forgotten. The 100 Years' War had ended, but its shadow would stretch across generations, echoing in every battlefield that followed, every kingdom that rose and fell, and every heart that learned what it meant to survive amid a world permanently reshaped by conflict. Even as France and England began the slow, painful process of recovering from the 100 Years' War, its effects continued to unfold in ways that were both subtle and profound. The war had lasted for over a century, yet its end did not bring the kind of immediate peace people often imagine. Villages were still haunted by memories of occupation. Farmers struggled to reclaim lands that had lain fallow for years, and towns had to rebuild not just physically, but socially and economically. Life, once taken for granted, now felt fragile. The elderly spoke of nights when soldiers rode through the streets, burning homes and demanding taxes, while children learned the stories of courage and cruelty alike. These stories shaped their sense of identity, not only as French or English, but as survivors in a world where the very rules of life and power had been rewritten. In France, the monarchy's power had grown stronger than it had ever been before. But that strength came with responsibility. Charles VII's reforms, retaining a standing army, investing in artillery, and centralizing taxation, ensured that France would no longer be a patchwork of feuding territories, vulnerable to foreign invasion. Yet governing a war-torn kingdom required more than laws and soldiers. It required patience, vision, and a deep understanding of human behavior. The people, weary of oppression from both English and local lords, demanded stability. Kings had to balance authority with pragmatism, or risk rebellion. Over time, France learned that power was as much about winning hearts and loyalty as it was about defeating enemies in battle. The social changes were equally significant. The war had shifted economic and class structures in subtle ways. Many noble families had been wiped out or weakened, their estates confiscated or sold to the crown or to new, wealthier citizens. Merchants and lesser gentry rose in influence, buying lands, funding reconstruction, and gaining a new foothold in a society once dominated by birthright. The feudal hierarchy had not disappeared, but it had been softened, transformed. Skill, resourcefulness, and wealth increasingly mattered as much as noble lineage. Cities grew slowly, but steadily. Trade began to flourish, and towns that had served as supply hubs during the war became permanent centers of commerce. The war, in its destruction, had created the conditions for new opportunities, changing the way people thought about power, property, and social mobility. England, on the other hand, suffered deeply from the war's legacy. The loss of French territories was not only a political blow, but a psychological one. The English had spent generations claiming lands across the Channel, and to lose them so completely was humiliating. The nobility turned their ambitions inward, fueling the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that consumed families and territories in a bloody struggle for the throne. Henry VI's weak leadership and mental instability only worsened matters. Civil war replaced foreign war, and the countryside, once spared from invasion by loyal kings, now bore the scars of domestic violence. England, having dreamed of continental dominance, had instead been forced to confront the fragility of its own political system. Military innovation continued to transform Europe in the aftermath of the war. The 100 Years' War had shown that traditional knights and cavalry charges, while dramatic and romantic, could be destroyed by strategy, organization, and new technologies like longbows and cannon. Castles, once thought invincible, were vulnerable to concentrated artillery fire. Armies required supply lines, training, and coordination, not simply courage. Kings and rulers across the continent began to reorganize their forces, hire permanent soldiers, and invest in fortifications designed to resist artillery. The lessons were clear. The era of chivalric warfare was ending, and the age of professional, disciplined armies was beginning. Warfare had become industrial in its logic, even if not in its technology, and no kingdom could ignore the implications. Culturally, the war left an indelible mark. Chroniclers and poets captured not only victories, but also the suffering of ordinary people. Songs and tales recounted the devastation of towns, the courage of soldiers, and the heroism of figures like Jeanne d'Arc. Her story, in particular, became a symbol of hope, resistance, and the power of belief. A peasant girl, ignored and underestimated, had altered the course of history. She proved that leadership and inspiration were not exclusive to kings or nobles. Her martyrdom and eventual canonization centuries later ensured that her influence would endure, shaping French identity and the idea of divine justice intertwined with national destiny. The psychological impact of the war endured across generations. For both nations, the memory of uncertainty, hunger, and sudden death remained vivid. People remembered that entire villages could be destroyed in a single night, that loyalties could shift overnight, and that kings could fail or succeed based on factors beyond their control. This awareness shaped policies, societies, and even family structures. People became cautious, pragmatic, and acutely aware of the fragility of stability. The war had taught not only military lessons, but also social and emotional ones, forcing nations to reckon with the human cost of prolonged conflict. Diplomatically, the 100 Years' War reshaped the balance of power in Europe. France emerged as a centralized state capable of projecting power, administering law, and raising armies efficiently. England, weakened and distracted by civil war, would eventually turn its focus toward maritime trade and colonization, setting the stage for future global expansion. Across the continent, monarchs studied the outcomes of the war carefully. They noted the rise of centralized authority, the importance of professional armies, and the necessity of political cohesion. The war had served as a harsh but effective lesson for all of Europe. Kingdoms that failed to adapt risked collapse, and survival depended on strategy, unity, and vision. Even as political and social structures stabilized, the land itself retained memory of the conflict. Battlefields, ruins, and abandoned fortresses became silent witnesses to a century of violence. Rivers flowed through towns that had once been sieged, and forests grew over fields once trampled by cavalry and artillery. Survivors remembered, passed down stories, and ensured that the war was never forgotten. The 100 Years' War had ended in armies, but it lived on in memory, shaping culture, identity, and historical consciousness for generations to come. And yet, the human story within the war was far from over. Generations that followed would grapple with its consequences. Fractured families, changed landscapes, and new societal hierarchies. The war had forged a France that understood unity and authority, and an England that learned the cost of overreach. It had introduced new technologies, redefined military strategy, and shaped the trajectory of European politics. Most importantly, it had left behind countless personal stories of courage, loss, resilience, and inspiration, reminding all who came after that, even in the face of relentless conflict, humanity endured, and sometimes humanity prevailed. The 100 Years' War had ended, yet its presence lingered in the rhythm of life, the architecture of towns, the structure of armies, and the consciousness of nations. And as Europe slowly stepped into the Renaissance, these lessons, the human cost of ambition, the power of resilience, and the inevitability of change remained, quietly shaping the world that had been forged in fire and blood. As the decades passed following the 100 Years' War, its shadow stretched far beyond the battlefields and into the hearts, minds, and very identities of France and England. In France, the war's end had brought a fragile peace, but the country's recovery was neither swift nor simple. Towns that had been repeatedly burned or sieged slowly returned to life. Cobblestone streets, once cracked and broken by cannon fire, were repaired market squares, where merchants had been driven away or killed, slowly refilled with the sounds of trade and haggling. Yet beneath the surface of renewal, the memory of destruction lingered. People remembered neighbors who had vanished in the night, husbands and sons who never returned from foreign campaigns, and the terror of living under the constant shadow of invading armies. These memories were not just personal, they became collective, shaping the way communities organized themselves taught their children and understood loyalty, leadership, and survival. The monarchy, having learned the harsh lessons of decades of war, solidified its power with careful precision. Charles VII had established a standing army and a system of centralized authority that allowed the crown to enforce law and maintain order in a kingdom previously fragmented by feudal rivalries. His reforms were not purely military. They extended to taxation, administration, and the judicial system by bringing local lords under closer supervision, restructuring taxes to ensure regular revenue, and investing in infrastructure such as roads and bridges. He strengthened the ability of the state to respond not only to external threats, but also to internal disorder. The old feudal loyalties that had once made rebellion almost inevitable were gradually replaced by allegiance to the crown itself. France was no longer merely a collection of territories. It was beginning to emerge as a nation in its own right, with shared identity and centralized governance. Yet this progress came with its own challenges. Many peasants and townsfolk had lost everything during the war: homes, lands, and loved ones. And rebuilding was often painstakingly slow. Agricultural production had been disrupted for decades, with fields left fallow and livestock slaughtered or stolen. The famine and depopulation caused by the war left deep scars, and the economic recovery required immense effort and patience. Nobles who had survived the war often struggled to reclaim their estates, while new families, merchants, and rising gentry seized the opportunities created by the redistribution of land and wealth. Slowly, a subtle social transformation unfolded. The rigid medieval hierarchy softened, and wealth, skill, and resilience became increasingly important alongside noble lineage. England's story, by contrast, was a cautionary tale of decline and introspection. Having lost almost all of its continental holdings, the English monarchy faced internal strife almost immediately. The fragile rule of Henry VI, combined with the ambitions and resentments of powerful noble families, triggered the Wars of the Roses. This internal conflict mirrored the intensity of the battles that had once raged in France, but with far more personal stakes. Brothers fought brothers, and allies became enemies overnight. The English countryside, which had escaped the physical devastation of French campaigns, now bore the psychological and emotional toll of civil war. Armies marched across familiar lands, yet the terror felt just as sharp. Familiar roads became sites of ambushes. Familiar castles became strongholds for warring factions, and villages caught in the crossfire suffered the same horrors that foreign invasions had once inflicted. England, which had once sought glory abroad, now grappled with survival at home. The military landscape of Europe had been irreversibly transformed by the 100 Years. War, cavalry charges, once considered the epitome of martial valor, were no longer decisive. Armies increasingly relied on disciplined infantry, archers, and the power of artillery. Castles and fortified towns, once symbols of near-absolute security, could be shattered by cannon, altering defensive strategies forever. Logistics, supply lines, and coordination became as vital as courage. Wars were no longer just contests of heroism. They were complex operations demanding strategy, planning, and administrative oversight. Kings and generals learned that victory depended not solely on bravery, but on the ability to manage men, resources, and technology effectively. Europe had witnessed the end of medieval warfare as it had existed for centuries. Culturally, the war left a permanent imprint on collective memory. Chroniclers recorded not only the battles, but also the immense human suffering that accompanied them. Poems, songs, and oral tales depicted the anguish of ordinary people. Burned villages, stolen food, and families torn apart by conscription. Stories of heroism were intertwined with tales of tragedy, creating a nuanced, somber narrative of war. Jeanne d'Arc, in particular, became the embodiment of hope, courage, and divine guidance. Her story of a young peasant girl leading armies, inspiring kings, and ultimately facing martyrdom resonated through generations. She represented the idea that even the smallest or most overlooked individuals could shape the course of history. That belief and conviction could alter destinies. Jeanne's legacy became inseparable from French identity, a symbol of resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Economically, the war had reshaped both nations. In France, reconstruction required labor, investment, and the redistribution of land. Abandoned estates and ruined villages created opportunities for new families and emerging social classes. Merchants gained influence. Towns regained their economic significance, and trade slowly flourished. In England, the financial strain of war, compounded by civil conflict, weakened the economy. Noble families sold lands to cover debts, while towns and merchants adapted to shifting economic realities. Both nations experienced a transformation in social mobility, where resourcefulness, skill, and adaptability could elevate one's position as effectively as noble birth. The psychological impact of the war endured for generations. Survivors, both in France and England, had experienced the fragility of life firsthand. People had learned that kings could fail, armies could collapse, and entire communities could be wiped out. This awareness shaped societal behavior, politics, and personal relationships. Communities became cautious, pragmatic, and highly aware of the consequences of political or military failure. The memory of the war became a quiet, persistent teacher, instructing nations about resilience, unity, consequences of ambition. Even in diplomacy, the war's legacy endured. France emerged as a centralized, cohesive power capable of projecting influence across Europe, while England, weakened by civil strife, began to focus on maritime trade and eventually global ambitions. The lessons of the 100 Years' War were studied in courts and councils across the continent. Monarchs understood that divided leadership could lead to disaster, that effective governance required strategy as much as force, and that centralized, professional armies were essential to national survival. Through all of this, the war remained alive in memory, in culture, and in identity. France and England were forever changed, not just in borders, but in the way they governed, fought, and remembered. Ordinary people carried the legacy in their stories, songs, and traditions, while kings and generals studied it as a lesson in power, strategy, and human endurance. The 100 Years' War had ended in armies, banners, and treaties. Yet it lived on in the hearts of those who endured it, and in the nations that rose from its ashes, even as Europe moved toward the Renaissance, with new ideas, technologies, and conflicts on the horizon. The lessons of this long, relentless war remained. They whispered through rebuilt towns, echoed in the halls of castles, and lingered in the collective consciousness of nations. History would not forget what had been endured, what had been lost, and what had been won. The 100 Years' War had become more than a series of battles. It had become a crucible, forging nations, identities, and legacies that would define Europe for centuries to come. As Europe slowly emerged from the chaos of the 100 Years' War, the true scale of its transformation became increasingly apparent. The war had not only redrawn borders and redefined kingdoms, but it had fundamentally reshaped the human experience itself. In France, life continued to bear the echoes of a century-long conflict. Towns and villages, once devastated by sieges and occupation, had been rebuilt. Yet their stones and streets carried the silent memory of bloodshed. Cobblestones were worn smooth, not only by the passage of carts and horses, but by the steady return of peasants, merchants, and travelers who navigated the landscape of survival and reconstruction. Markets reopened. Workshops buzzed with the sounds of hammers and looms, and the rhythm of daily life gradually returned. But beneath this revival lay an undercurrent of resilience and caution, a hard-earned understanding that prosperity could be threatened by forces beyond human control, and that survival often depended on prudence as much as courage. The monarchy's consolidation of power continued to shape French society in profound ways. Charles VII and his successors realized that a kingdom could no longer rely solely on noble loyalty. Centralized authority, disciplined armies, and organized administration were essential. Standing armies, a radical innovation at the time, became a permanent feature of governance, ensuring that the crown could maintain order and enforce laws across all territories. Nobles, whose private armies had once wielded immense power, found their influence curtailed, their roles redefined within the hierarchy of the centralized state. Taxation, legal structures, and infrastructure improvements all reinforced the authority of the monarchy, creating a framework for national stability that would endure long after the last cannon fire. The war had taught that survival, governance, and national unity required foresight, planning, and organization, not simply courage or brute force. In England, the aftermath was far more turbulent. The loss of French territories had struck a blow not just to pride, but to political and economic stability. The Wars of the Roses erupted, consuming the country in a bitter civil conflict that lasted for decades. The noble families, who had once served as pillars of the monarchy, turned their ambitions inward, fighting over succession and influence. Entire regions were destabilized. Villages caught in the crossfire suffered as deeply as they had under foreign invasions, and the ordinary population experienced the same horrors they had witnessed across the Channel. Now, on their home soil, England's national ambitions in France had failed, leaving the kingdom to face internal strife and the challenge of rebuilding both governance and identity from within. Yet, amidst this turbulence, the war had sparked a profound evolution in military thinking. The battles of the 100 Years' War had demonstrated that traditional methods, knights charging into battle, feudal levies, fighting sporadically, castles relying solely on walls and moats, were no longer sufficient. Longbows, artillery, and the careful coordination of trained infantry had become decisive factors. Castles, once symbols of near invincibility, could now be breached by cannon fire. Armies required meticulous planning, logistics, and discipline, transforming warfare into a complex, industrial-like process long before the Industrial Revolution. The lessons of Agincourt, Orleans, and Castellan influenced military strategy across Europe, emphasizing that organization and innovation often mattered more than bravery alone. Culturally, the 100 Years' War left a profound and enduring mark. Chroniclers, poets, and storytellers began to shift their focus, portraying not only the valor of soldiers and kings, but the immense suffering of ordinary people. Songs recounted burned villages, stolen harvests, and families torn apart by conscription. The tales of Jeanne d'Arc became emblematic of this duality. Courage and tragedy intertwined. Her story of a young, devout peasant girl who rallied an army, inspired a king, and ultimately faced martyrdom remained central to French identity. Jeanne demonstrated that even the seemingly powerless could shape history, reminding generations that belief, conviction, and moral courage could alter the course of events in ways that brute force alone could not. Economically, the war had accelerated social change in both kingdoms. In France, Reconstruction allowed new social classes to emerge. Merchants, skilled artisans, and minor gentry gained influence as they filled the gaps left by weakened or destroyed noble families. In England, civil conflict and economic disruption forced adaptations that ultimately strengthened trade networks and urban economies. Even as the nobility clashed violently over succession, across both nations, wealth, resourcefulness, and skill began to rival noble birth as determinants of social and economic power. The rigid medieval order had softened, creating a subtle but irreversible shift in societal structures. The psychological legacy of the war was equally profound. Survivors and their descendants had witnessed the fragility of life and the unpredictability of fate. Kings could fail, armies could collapse, and communities could be devastated overnight. This awareness cultivated a cautious, pragmatic approach to life and governance. It also reinforced the importance of unity, resilience, and long-term planning. The war had become a silent teacher, imparting lessons about human endurance, the costs of ambition, and the necessity of cooperation and foresight. Diplomatically, the war influenced European politics for generations. France's strengthened monarchy and centralized governance allowed it to project power and influence across the continent, laying the groundwork for future dominance. England, having retreated from continental ambitions, began to turn toward maritime trade and exploration, sowing the seeds for the future expansion of the British Empire. Across Europe, rulers studied the outcomes of the conflict, learning the importance of centralized authority, professional armies, and strategic planning. The 100 Years' War became a reference point, a cautionary tale, and a model for understanding the evolution of statecraft and military organization. Through all these changes, the war remained alive in memory and culture. Battlefields, ruins, and abandoned fortresses were silent witnesses to the devastation that had shaped an era. Survivors passed down stories of endurance, heroism, and suffering, ensuring that the lessons of the war remained present in daily life. Literature, song, and oral tradition preserved these memories, shaping the identities of nations and communities for generations. France and England were forever changed, not only in borders and politics, but in the ways people governed, fought, and remembered. Even as Europe moved into the Renaissance, with its promise of new ideas, art, and science, the echoes of the 100 Years' War persisted. Its lessons about resilience, the cost of ambition, the power of leadership, and the fragility of life continued to resonate. Kings, generals, and ordinary people alike carried the memory of its battles, sieges, and tragedies, war had ended in treaties and coronations. Yet it lived on in culture, governance, and collective consciousness, a reminder that history is shaped as much by human endurance and suffering as by victory or loss. The 100 Years' War had become more than a series of battles. It had become a crucible, forging not only nations, but the identities, strategies, and ambitions of the people who survived it. And though the cannons had fallen silent and the banners had been lowered, its lessons continued to echo across Europe, quietly shaping the world that was to come. The echoes of the 100 Years' War stretched far beyond the battlefields, far beyond the kings, courts, and the army's camps, lingering in the hearts of ordinary people who had endured hunger, fear, and loss for more than a century. In France, the land itself seemed to bear the scars of conflict. Fields that had once been the lifeblood of villages were still dotted with remnants of fortifications and hastily buried dead. Rivers that had carried soldiers and supplies now reflected quiet skies. But even in their stillness, they seemed to whisper of the chaos that had passed. Towns that had survived repeated sieges were rebuilt, yes, but their streets carried a weight of memory. Children learned stories of burned farms, marauding soldiers, and families torn apart. Stories that would become part of the fabric of their identity. Life had returned, yet it was different, tempered, measured, and profoundly aware of fragility. The monarchy in France had emerged transformed. The crown's authority was no longer simply ceremonial. It was real, tangible, and enforced with both administrative skill and military power. Charles VII and his successors understood that to govern effectively, they had to think beyond immediate threats. They maintained standing armies, organized professional bureaucracies, and ensured that law and order reached even the most remote corners of the kingdom. Nobles who had once been autonomous warlords now owed allegiance directly to the crown. Castles that had served as centers of local power were absorbed into the network of royal authority. Their walls no longer symbols of feudal defiance, but instruments of centralized control. The French state, born out of chaos and warfare, had become stronger and more coherent than it had ever been before. England, in contrast, faced a more painful reckoning. The loss of its French territories had been a profound psychological blow, undermining centuries of ambition and reshaping national identity. The Wars of the Roses consumed the kingdom, leaving deep wounds among the nobility and common people alike. Families that had once wielded power and influence now fought bitterly against one another, turning the landscape of their own country into a battlefield. Yet even amidst this chaos, England began to adapt. The economic focus shifted. Trade, commerce, and eventually overseas exploration became avenues for recovery and growth, laying the foundation for future global influence. the nation had learned, sometimes painfully, that survival required flexibility, foresight, and a willingness to change course when ambition alone could not succeed. The human cost of the war remained staggering. Estimates suggest that millions had died across Europe, not only from battles, but from famine, disease, and displacement. Entire generations were altered by trauma and loss. Yet, even in the shadow of such devastation, resilience persisted. Families rebuilt farms and homes, merchants reopened markets, and communities found ways to survive, adapt, and endure. The war had destroyed much, but it had also forged a new understanding of endurance, resourcefulness, and the capacity of ordinary people to shape history in the absence of kings and armies. Militarily, the 100 Years' War had changed Europe forever. The era of heavily armored knights dominating the battlefield was ending. Longbows, artillery, and coordinated infantry had proven decisive, transforming the nature of warfare. Castles were no longer impregnable. Professional soldiers were more important than feudal levies. Strategy, logistics, and technological innovation became the cornerstones of military success. Generals and kings learned that courage and valor alone could not guarantee victory, that preparation, planning, and adaptation were just as vital. These lessons would influence European conflicts for centuries to come. From the Italian wars to the Napoleonic campaigns, shaping the very concept of war itself. Culturally, the war's legacy endured through stories, songs, and art. Jeanne d'Arc remained a symbol of courage, faith, and the extraordinary power of an individual to alter the course of history. Chroniclers immortalized not only her victories, but also the suffering of the common people, the merchants, farmers, and peasants who had endured so much. Their stories formed the backbone of historical memory, reminding future generations that wars are not only fought by kings and soldiers, but also endured by those who must survive in their shadow. The 100 Years' War became more than a military conflict. It became a narrative of human endurance, tragedy, and resilience. Economically and socially, the war accelerated profound transformations. In France, new social classes emerged as merchants, artisans, and minor gentry gained influence. In England, the focus on trade and internal consolidation shaped a society increasingly reliant on skill, commerce, and urban centers, rather than solely on hereditary nobility. Across Europe, feudal hierarchies softened, and wealth, resourcefulness, and strategic alliances began to define status alongside birthright. The war had rewritten the rules not just of battle, but of society itself. Politically, the war demonstrated the necessity of strong, centralized states. France emerged with a monarchy capable of enforcing law and projecting power. England, weakened but adaptive, learned to focus on internal cohesion and the creation of new economic and strategic priorities. Across Europe, rulers recognized that survival and influence depended on organization, foresight, and the ability to harness both military and administrative tools effectively. The lessons were clear. Kingdoms divided by internal rivalries or unable to innovate were doomed to fail, while those that adapted could endure and even thrive in a world forever changed by conflict. Ultimately, the 100 Years' War left a legacy that extended far beyond borders, treaties, or battles. It shaped national identities, redefined warfare, transformed societies, and left an indelible imprint on culture and memory. It was a war of kings and armies, but also a war that touched every village, every farm, and every family in France and England. Its stories of bravery, suffering, and resilience became woven into the fabric of European consciousness, ensuring that the lessons of endurance, strategy, and would never be forgotten. And so, while the cannons fell silent and the banners were lowered for the final time, the 100 Years' War remained alive, not in the echo of battle cries, but in the enduring spirit of the people it had shaped. It was a testament to the capacity for survival, the inevitability of change, and the power of memory. Through fire and blood, through loss and triumph, Europe had been forged anew. The war had ended, but its story, its lessons, and its legacy would endure forever. Whispered through the stones of rebuilt towns, sung in the songs of generations, and remembered in the hearts of all who learned what it meant to endure, to rebuild, and to prevail against the most relentless of adversities.